We're going to talk about a subject that doesn't necessarily pertain to everybody on the mission field, simply because not all missionaries are married and bear children. But because most of them typically are and do have children, we're going to take a few moments to talk about this very, very important subject of family and education. Even if you go as a single missionary, you'll find that your input and counsel can be very valuable in helping those who are struggling to know what their role is with regard to their spouses and or children. I will tell you right up front that this is a subject that is very personal, and even though there are good, solid biblical principles, a lot of the details that couples and parents have to decide are not specifically spelled out in Scripture. And so there's a lot that needs to be done in order to make sure that each one is following God's direction. So this will be an overview, but let's take a look at some of the things that come up in the area of education and family relationships. First of all, let's begin with the wife's role as a missionary. Now, you might ask, why aren't we starting with the husband? Well, because that's not normally an issue. When a married couple or young family is preparing to go to the field, nobody's going to ask the husband, so are you going to be a missionary? That's understood. But what about the wife? Is she considered a missionary, or is she considered a wife who is going along to help the missionary? And that may sound like a very minor detail or question to ask, but it does make a lot of sense when it comes to the role that the wife plays as a missionary. And again, there are lots of ways that this question can be answered. The short answer is whatever she would be as a wife in any other ministry. In other words, the fact that the couple is going to the mission field doesn't suddenly change the fundamental nature of who she's going to be as she serves alongside her husband. Whether she's a pastor's wife or a missionary wife or a camp director's wife or something like that, she's going to be expected to fit the role of a wife in any ministry context. Now, obviously, there can be some special situations on the field regarding cultural adjustment and, the role of the wife in that culture, and we'll talk about those things as we move through this. For those of you who are either married now or going to be married, are going to be wives, I want to just encourage you a little bit about the expectations regarding the wife on the mission field. And you gentlemen who are either married or going to be married, I hope you'll pay attention to this as well, because it's really, really important that the husband is sensitive to the role of his wife and the expectations that he and others place upon her. There are some wives who are just expected to be entertainers. I mean, you're in ministry, and so your home is going to be crawling with visitors, and you better know how to be a good entertainer, because after all, if you don't do a good job, you're going to cast a bad image of the entire family on those who are exposed to your household. On the mission field, we had a gal, one of our colleagues, who was an excellent entertainer. In fact, she has a sister who has a bed and breakfast and just does really well in that area. And she herself, the missionary, had considered becoming an interior designer because she was really good at that. And God had other plans, took her to the field, and man, did she do a good job as an entertainer. I mean, everything was just, if you were invited over to her house, every detail in that house was arranged just so. And it was really, really impressive. The problem is, some of the other wives tended to look at that and think, wow, I can never be that. I can't entertain that way. It's not my gift. And sometimes we tend to compare ourselves and get discouraged because of what others are good at and what we may not be quite as competent in doing. Going along with this is the idea of being a gourmet cook. This same gal who was good at entertaining was also very good at cooking. And she came up with some recipes that nobody had ever seen before, and man, were they good. And again, some of the other wives may have tended to look at her and say, I can't reach that standard. So when I have people over to my house, is that going to make me less effective as a servant of God? Am I going to be letting my husband down because I can't do these things well? Again, let me caution you. These are areas of of giftedness that both the husband and wife, not to mention the colleagues and the sending church, need to be aware of. Because if a wife doesn't have some of these gifts, she shouldn't be expected to do what God has not enabled her to do. Visitation partner. It is a good idea for the wife to be along when visiting, especially when the missionary or pastor is visiting a single gal. In fact, I would caution any minister of the gospel, a male, not to enter into the house of a single gal who's home alone. That's just not good counsel. And so some missionaries resolve that by saying, every time I go out to visit, people in our ministry, I want you to go along. Now, sometimes that works well, other times it doesn't. If the missionary is going to expect his wife to go along every time he goes out calling, then he needs to understand that she may need to make some adjustments when it comes to how much she'll get done at home, or how she may handle the kids who need to get to bed at a certain hour at night, and that sort of thing. Church pianist. Well, obviously, if you're going to be the wife of a pastor or a missionary, you need to be a musician, because music's a big part of ministry, and you should be expected to be competent in that area. Well, maybe not. Okay, so this is something, again, that a couple needs to talk about very seriously before they ever get to the place of ministry. I know of one case where a gal who could barely play the piano was expected to get on the stick and pick this up and learn how to play hymns, because there's nobody else to do it, and we're starting services next week. Well, be careful. If a woman doesn't have that ability, then don't expect her to do something she can't do. And many women have been driven away from ministry because of embarrassment and feeling shamed by not being able to perform in a musical capacity. Should the wife be the Sunday school superintendent? Well, there may be times when that's very much reasonable. She's adequate for that. She enjoys doing it, and she can handle that. But she may not be a person that's good at that sort of thing. And again, it has to be considered. Church secretary. Well, the husband's busy preparing sermons or Sunday school lessons and calling on people, counseling people, and so who's going to take care of the books and make sure that things are organized in the church? Well, some wives are very good at that and just love doing that. Others really struggle in the area of record keeping. Counselor. Now, there's a certain sense in which every believer should be able to exhort, to confront other believers and talk to them. I'm using the word counselor a little more in the quote-unquote professional sense of a wife being able to sit down and handle, some very, very difficult, thorny situations with the expectation that she'll know exactly when to say and how to and all of that. Again, some ministry wives struggle in that area, and while they should be able to exhort other ladies in a general sense, the level of expectation needs to be considered carefully. Athlete. Hey, the people in our country where we're serving love soccer, and so we're going to start a soccer ministry. And the wife says, I've never played soccer. I have no idea. Well, you better learn, because there are a lot of women here that enjoy soccer, and I want you to help me. Okay. Again, it may be a better route is to say, hey, since you're not good at soccer, why don't you be the one that prepares the refreshments? Bring some lemonade or some Coke and some cookies so we can take a break in the middle of the soccer game and enjoy some goodies together. There are ways to handle that. Homeschool teaching. We're going to talk about education here in just a little bit. But again, on our place, in our field of ministry, there were 4 wives who were serving together, and 3 of them were fairly competent at homeschooling. But one of them, in fact, it happened to be the one that was very good at entertaining and cooking, didn't feel as comfortable in the area of educating her children. And she really struggled with that. Now, God gave us a special situation because there were 4 wives, 4 couples working together. The other 3 wives were able to join with her and share some of the education responsibilities. That was a very good situation. But what do you do if it's just you two on the field and no colleagues, and you've got to educate your kids, you know. So again, we'll talk more about that when we deal with the issue of MK education. Being a financial manager, hey, you got to take care of the books. I mean, we don't want to be irresponsible with the Lord's money, and if we're going to expect these nationals to give toward the work, we better show them that we're not here just to drain their money and get rich off of them. And because there are some that do kind of think that when you first show up on the field. So, well, some wives, again, are good at that, some not so much. And then just another example, chauffeur. The husband says, hey, I'm preparing sermons. I got to make sure the church looks good and ready to go. So, honey, you've got to go out and pick everybody up who's coming. Because in some countries, for example, people don't have cars and they come from a ways. And so the missionary pastor may expect his wife to get in the car and go around and pick up some people for church. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But again, all of these items need to be discussed. A lot of tensions in the marital relationship have arisen because husbands and wives have failed to sit down ahead of time and talk through these types of things and others like them and say, where has God gifted you? Where has God gifted me? How do our gifts dovetail? What are the areas where neither one of us is strong, where we may need to just ask God to give us special wisdom to work through this together if we don't have a colleague who can help us out? And so that's something that is very, very important to deal with. You don't just arrive on the field and say, okay, this has to be done. You do it, because that can cause a lot of tension and even result in ministerial ruin if you're not careful. All right, so that's just a quick overview. Again, ladies, make sure that you and your husbands talk about these things before you get there, and that everybody has a good understanding of the types of gifts that God has given. Let me just say this. God gives his people the gifts that are necessary and adequate for the work he has them to do. God will never put you in a situation where he demands that you do something that he has not enabled you to do. And so keep that in mind and be realistic when it comes to the expectations that you place on each other. The long answer. Now, you might say, well, that was kind of a long answer. Yeah, maybe it seemed like it, but here's what I mean. There are some questions that we need to ask as it relates to the wife's role on the field. And one of those is, what does the home church expect the wife to do? And that's a very good question. Your sending church should really sit down with the missionary couple and talk about this. There are some churches that just expect the wife to be a full-time missionary. And what if you have 2 or 3 children? Well, you have to work around that, because after all, we're supporting you to be a missionary. And so you're going to have to find a way to take care of the kids and still be a full-time missionary. Now, let me just say, I'm very happy to say that rarely happens. In fact, in all the years we served in Brazil, never once did any of our supporting churches approach us like that. All of them said, we understand that your first role is in the home. And as you are able to participate with your husband outside the home in ministry, then we will prayerfully seek his guidance. And so don't think that churches by and large are going to be extra hard on the wives. Our situation, our experience has been very, very positive in that regard. And it's also important to ask what other missionary wives do. I mentioned that we had 4 couples working together in our place of ministry. And so sometimes we sat down as couples and asked, what is your wife good at? What does she do? And the wives would sometimes just get together and say, man, I'm really struggling in this area. You do such a good job in this, and I'm wrestling with this. And kind of get a feel for how what the expectations of the wife is on the field. And don't forget to ask this very important third question. How does the host culture view the role of the wife? That's very, very important. It doesn't mean that you are necessarily going to imitate everything that the wives in that culture do. They know that you are foreigners. They know that you have a different way of life. And so, the question you have to ask is, to what extent do I approximate the kind of lives, the roles that national wives play as compared to my role as an American wife? And that will help you out. In fact, if you try simply to imitate what wives do in the foreign culture, you might find that it actually comes back to haunt you, because they may think you're trying to imitate them, which could actually turn out to be offensive. So I'm just giving you a quick bird's eye view. There's so much to think about in this regard, but I hope that at least this will give you some things to think about as you head in that direction.